basically, can we interpret forecasts or model, IMF decisions or IMF minutes? So, Dr. Angın, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those who are across the pond, I guess. So before I start, just as a recap of what we did with the organizers of the workshop, we actually firstly talked about possible ways of presenting agent-based modeling to you. And I actually first considered coding an agent-based model with you, like, together. But Java is the language I use, and I've been told that a few of the participants actually code in Java. And obviously, it's not the only language for computational simulation. It just happens to be the language I use. Long story short, I learned it when I was an undergrad, and it's a beautiful language, so I've stuck to it. But I mean, since it's a lot more difficult to learn than Python, for simplicity purposes, I guess I would just not suggest sparing time to learn it only for ABM. So then we've decided that a tutorial on how one case could be integrated, like, to computational simulation to social science research could be useful. So therefore, today I will present you the first leg of an ongoing project, which I carried from the University of Oxford to Harvard University first, and then to Koç University this past year. So this project aims to shed light on the processes leading to variation in IMF conditionality. And for that purpose, I use mixed methods, including computational simulation, machine learning, natural language processing, and case studies. Although computational simulation is really now widely used in the field of ethnic conflict, civil war, it really has not been fully explored by international political economy scholars yet. And that is what I aim to do with this research. I mean, things are changing today. Back then, when I was a PhD student, and both of my co-advisors were game theorists, one of them being an economist actually, I was always asked why I didn't simply put a game theoretical model to my dissertation. The beauty of ABM is to have the flexibility of including as many actors as you like, focusing on microprocesses while you can still present the grand picture neatly. So today I will focus on the computation simulation and case study part of the project in order to show how to integrate agent-based modeling to your research. And case study section of the research is actually a comparative study of 3 Southeast European countries, namely Turkey, Romania, and Greece. But presenting all these obviously is beyond the scope of this tutorial. But as I am aware of the fact that the audience might not necessarily be familiar with decision-making at international financial institutions, I chose the case of Turkey to make kind of a debut to the literature, so the simulation part will make a lot more sense to you all. Therefore, I will go in reverse order and present you the case study first, together with the hypothesis and the two-level principal agency model that I use, which then will be followed by a simplified agent-based model that focuses on program negotiations for a country like Turkey. So without further ado, let me start the presentation. So sharing my screen with you. I'm having trouble when I go full screen, but I hope you are still able to see it clearly like this. Okay. Then moving on. So let me start with the puzzle of the research while you're looking at the outline of the talk. Questioning the legitimacy of the International Monetary Fund really became fairly popular after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, especially following the East Asian crisis of 1997, regularly by those who believe that the fund, in a way, failed in fulfilling its mission. And in the early 2000s, the IMF was actually transformed into an international financial institution whose mandate was mainly providing technical assistance rather than an international lender of last resort. However, things have been changing since the financial crisis of 2008, followed by the European debt crisis that erupted in the wake of the Great Recession. The IMF, we actually refer to it as the fund in the literature usually, was literally born out of its ashes, I would say, following years of legitimacy crisis. And particularly after the London summit of 2009, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was then the managing director, openly stated that the IMF is back. So these developments actually caused a growing intellectual curiosity regarding the institution, which led to the research I will present in a bit. As I said, it's actually an extensive research project, which includes not only the computational simulation, but also interviews with the IMF staff, executive directors, borrowing country bureaucrats, and ministers that are conducted to analyze the variations in IMF conditionality. Also, as a result of the pandemic, we are, in a way, see a growing role for the IMF, meaning that we will continue this research, taking into account a major external shock to the system. But for now, I will present you the existing literature and the current findings. So, briefly on the literature examining the institutional aspects of the IMF includes the state-centric approach, which focuses on the influence of the powerful states in explaining the variation in the conditionality of IMF loans, and the public choice approaches, which put a greater emphasis on the intellectual dominance of the IMF staff. However, neither of these approaches really fully explains the variation, as they in a way neglect the impact of the relation between the IMF executive board, the IMF staff, and the recipient country authorities on the design of the IMF programs. And despite substantial, I would say, empirical studies, there is still an ongoing debate about the main factors explaining the variation in conditionality shaping IMF programs. And in this context, two questions are at the core of this research. What factors influence the number and scope of conditionality of an IMF program? And how do those factors play into shaping the design of the programs? And as I said, to address these two questions, I focus on case studies where we get variation in number and scope of conditionality over time. I mean, if a country was getting favorable conditions from the fund due to its strategic importance for the US or the G5 countries in general, then how do we explain the variation in conditionality across programs implemented in the same country? So in my research, I therefore challenge this common belief that the strategic allies of the US are always favored by the IMF, whereas it is the IMF staff who has the main leverage over the design of conditionality when low-income countries are borrowing from the fund. And I argue that what we observe in reality is that the difference between these two cases is more subtle than expected. So let's take a quick look at the simplified view of IMF governance, which doesn't really look too simple, I know. Although this decision-making flowchart demonstrates the mandates of each actor, it does not really capture the influence and importance of these actors. We do not have much information about the relation between the staff and the executive board, and the same applies to the relation between the staff and borrowing country authorities. The extensive authority delegated to the IMF management really weakens the executive board and causes a great deal of information asymmetries. And in that context, I'm using a principal agent model to analyze the impact of the relation between the IMF executive board, IMF staff, and recipient country bureaucrats and the recipient country government. Principal agency theory, as some of you may or may not know, argues that incomplete and asymmetric information leads to this principal agent problem, which refers to the situation that the principal faces difficulties in deeming the agent responsible for seeking the interests of the principal. And the flexibility of the principal agency theory, in a way, makes it a useful tool for understanding international organizations and modeling their performance through examination of the interactions among the politics and preferences of member states. internal incentives for IO staff and recipient country actors. However, most of the work in the principal agency tradition is actually based on rather thin assumptions regarding agent interests, which are mainly maximization of budget and agency slack, as well as task expansion. So the shortcomings in this literature inspired me to form a two-level principal agent model for this research. I mean, clearly, Robert Putnam's two-level game metaphor was an inspiration here. At level 1, we observed the negotiations between two agents, namely the IMF staff and the recipient country authorities, whereas at level 2, the principal agency problems between the political principles of these agents, the IMF executive board and the recipient government are analyzed. So I claim, therefore, that in order to have a full picture of this principal agency problem in the design of IMF programs, we need to take into account both sets of relationships. And I've chosen not to consider the relation between the executive board and the recipient country, since the staff actually acts as a mediator between the two, and I observe the IMF management and the staff as a unitary actor. So therefore, I limit my discussion to the basic delegation from states to an IO, but I do acknowledge, obviously, that each step in the chains of delegation may lead to increases in agency slack. So taking a more kind of an in-depth look to the levels, at level 1, the negotiations for an IMF program involve interactions among bureaucratic agents, and therefore making any observations at this level requires a really clear understanding of bureaucratic incentives. The main factors making up, again, the bureaucrat's utility function may include prestige, power, and influence at the institution. Assuming a zero-sum relation between the IMF staff and the recipient country bureaucrats also fails in explaining the cases where both sets of actors make decisions based on the same economic rationality emanating from similar educational backgrounds. Therefore, the existence of contending views of these two agents on the design of the program should not be taken for granted, as the seeming differences in the preferences might be originating from preferences of their political principles at level 2. So for level 2, one of the causal mechanisms I trace in the case study, at least, is the autonomic delegation by the executive board, which involves assignment of complex tasks to the IMF staff, which could lead to increased concern about maintaining the legitimacy of both the IMF and their own success on the staff side. So this path-dependent causal mechanism is observed to influence the negotiations of a program with insistence on stricter conditionality by the IMF, acting rather precautious in response to criticisms by the executive board regarding the design of previous program. I mean, it's important to note here that the IMF actually has the structure of a barbarian bureaucracy, in the sense that there is a strict hierarchy in the authority relationships, and the goals of the individuals in the institution actually match the goals of the institution itself. And the staff designs the programs based on, once again, economic rationality, unlike the executive directors, who also have political concerns. The executive board delegates, as I said, a substantial degree of autonomy to the staff, who has the economic expertise and is concerned about both maintaining the legitimacy of the institution and his or her own prestige, meaning that fear of failure and the desire to minimize criticism is at work. It is a challenging task to tailor a program that is supposed to save a country facing a deep economic crisis, which is obviously usually the case when a country is borrowing from the IMF. However, if that country is strategically important to the political principle, the executive board tells the IMF staff to sign an agreement regardless. And that is risky for the institution because if the program fails, the legitimacy of the IMF will be damaged. Besides, the executive board might put the blame on the staff for designing a program that could not yield satisfactory results. Therefore, the IMF staff may design tough programs with many strings attached, especially in cases where the executive board demonstrated discontent with the design of a previous program in order to ensure that even if a program fails, the IMF will not be declared as a scapegoat. So the second mechanism influencing the design of an IMF program has to do with the power of the bureaucracy in the recipient country. The extent of the authority delegated by the government to the bureaucrats is not constant across programs. When bureaucrats gain power as a result of an economic crisis, they will attempt to, in a way, seize the opportunity to push for reforms that they could not implement under normal circumstances. So through increased leverage over negotiation processes resulting from greater delegation of authority by the government during times of economic hardship, what I term as reform-minded bureaucrats in a borrowing country are able to implement reforms that they would otherwise not, that could not be possible due to political contentiousness. And through that mechanism, increased power of economic bureaucracy in a borrowing country therefore manifests itself as a wider scope and greater number of conditionality in the programs, especially in cases where bureaucrats and the IMF staff have similar educational backgrounds again. So the final mechanism of influence is also related to domestic politics of the recipient country, particularly to the level of fragmentation in the political system of the recipient country during the program negotiations. So while a fragmented coalition government is likely to consist of political actors of diverse views regarding many issues, among which could be conditionality, obviously, a single party government is much more unified in a stance on acceptance of various conditions proposed for inclusion in IMF programs. So a high degree of fragmentation in the political system therefore demonstrates itself as weakened bargaining power for the recipient country at the negotiations, resulting in increased scope and number of conditionality in the program. So therefore, going back to the earlier slide where I put my main argument, both a fragmented political system and severe economic crisis cause more conditionality, as economic crises lead to higher authority delegated to the bureaucrats at the domestic level, and a fragmented political system leads to coordination problems, weakening bargaining power of the recipient country, while autonomic delegation, as I said, involving assignment of complex tasks to the IMF, leads the IMF staff to increase conditionality. So what we do, as I said in this project, is a mixed methods approach. Process tracing on Turkey is the one I'm going to present you today, followed by the computational simulation of the IMF program design. I cannot assume that you all are familiar with the case of Turkey, or even if you are, you don't necessarily know the details, and you don't really have to, but just for the sake of talking about my selection criteria, through analyzing there are 4 cases of IMF programs ranging from mid-sized to large ones between 1994 and 2008, I traced the causal processes that explain the variation in number of scope of conditionality, based once again on the analysis of interviews, recorded minutes of the executive board meetings, which really provides significant insights into the views of the executive directors. For the case of Turkey, I conducted 40 semi-structured interviews with key Turkish politicians, bureaucrats of the Minister of Finance, former state planning organizations, central bank, etc., who were engaged in designing these programs, and the relevant IMF staff, obviously, including mission chiefs, resident representatives, as well as a number of executive directors. But once again, before going into details, not too many details, let me briefly talk about my case selection. Turkey, who is, or at least used to be, a key ally of the United States, is an interesting case to study, not only because of its importance for G5 countries, but also because it used to be one of the most ardent borrowers of the IMF, despite the consecutive crises it faced following implementation of IMF programs. And Turkey in total signed 19 standby arrangements with the fund. And it also managed to borrow resources over 15 times its IMF quota, which leads us to think that the quota system is not as strong as long as the borrower is strategically important for G5 countries, which is in line with the state-centric approach I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It was actually, especially the approval of lending approximately 13 billion SDR. SDR is special drawing rates. You can consider it as the IMF's currency in a way. In February 2002, which was then the largest one that the IMF extended, that makes one think that the US was pushing the IMF for providing big loans to Turkey. And as I said, Turkey can be considered as a crucial case to study because on the one hand, one may assume that Turkey should be getting more favorable conditions with fewer strings attached to the loans due to, once again, its strategic proximity, as well as its economic relations with G5. On the other hand, we observed many strings attached to the loans Turkey received between 1999 and 2005. And that leads us to cast doubt on the state-centric approach, claiming that the strategic allies of the US are always favored by the IMF. So analyzing the numerous standby arrangements signed with the fund really provides us with variation in conditionality over time, which extends by itself the scope of this research beyond a single case study. So here I put the main variables that enter the model, and you can see the variation here. Crisis intensity, we use Reinhardt-Rogoff crisis tally measure. Fragmentation political system is quite straightforward. It takes the value of 1 if it's a single party government, 2 when there's 2 coalition partners, 3 when there's 3. Conditionality scope codes the number of categories, if you will, that are attached to an IMF loan the country is getting, and number is just counting the numbers of these conditions. So under the same category, you can get multiple conditionality, so we count it separately. And executive board discontent is a variable that I coded myself. So each time an executive director raised a concern about, actually a criticism about the way an IMF program was designed by the staff, I counted. And then we assigned a certain score to that. The current version of the project is using natural language processing. We are doing a sentiment analysis to measure executive board discontent. And we're doing that for all of the IMF programs implemented since 1980s. But obviously, when you're manually doing that, it's not possible. Even if you have a whole team of RAs, it's still not so easy to do that. But we're hoping to also manually code at least a random sample of some other countries and see what we get. But going back to what I was saying, we got to talk about, obviously, the observable implications in order to do process tracing. And by concentrating on the step-by-step process of IMF program design, these 4 cases helped me in testing, in a way, my argument that both a fragmented political system and severe economic crisis at the domestic level and autonomic delegation from the executive board leads the staff to increase conditionality. So for autonomic delegation, I mean, in cases like Turkey, where, again, a strategically important country for the US and G5 is borrowing from the IMF, while the macroeconomic fundamentals do not really look too promising, the IMF staff is supposed to design a program that can be portrayed as a success story. However, the design of such programs providing large loans is by itself a very complex task, especially when the country is facing a severe economic crisis. Therefore, If the executive directors are not content with the result of a program and criticize the IMF staff regarding the design, the staff might be more cautious the next time the country is borrowing. Accordingly, I expect to see the IMF staff designing a program with more extensive conditionality when the executive board was not content with the design for a previous program implemented in the same country. So therefore, there is path dependence at this level, and process tracing is precisely the technique to be applied to such type of causal process occurring in cases consisting of, sequence of events, some of which in a way foreclose certain paths in the development. So analyzing the relevant executive board meeting minutes, therefore, is really central to spotting this principal agency problem. And it is necessary to note that the discontent of executive directors of the IMF may not always be directed at the IMF staff. The executive board might simply demonstrate disappointment with the country's poor performance, while in some cases they blame the IMF staff regarding the design of the program if it does not yield the expected results. So if the executive board is content with the performance, they will most probably praise both actors. In this context, I expect to see evidence of the executive board's explicit criticisms addressed to the staff in order to observe what we call autonomic delegation. So, so for bureaucratic power, Turkey went through 3 major crises between 1994 and 2001, which corresponds to 3 programs implemented while borrowing from the fund. So I expect to find evidence in the interviews, at least, for greater authority delegated to Turkish bureaucrats during times of these economic crises. And the reformist bureaucrats can use the IMF as a scapegoat, in a way, to push for reforms that the government would not be willing to implement under normal circumstances, which results in more extensive conditionality. Since there are numerous large-end studies explaining IMF lending behavior with economic variables as key determinants, making sense of the correlation between economic crisis intensity and number and scope of conditionality might actually look quite straightforward at first glance. However, as I said, different causal mechanisms could be at play, and a severe economic crisis gives more authority to the bureaucracy, who makes use of, in a way, enhanced agenda setting power to tailor the design of program according to the economic rationale instead of the political interests of the government. So accordingly, I expect to see inclusion of reforms which had been on the agenda of Turkey and had not been implemented due to political reluctance following the crisis. And then finally, system fragmentation. So the political conditions of the 1994 and 2002 periods and 2003-2008 periods in Turkey were widely dissimilar in the sense that the first one can be distinguished by its fragmented party system with consecutive coalition governments, whereas a single party government has been ruling the country in the second period. So in a coalition government, obviously, each coalition partner rules a different ministry, which really causes coordination problems among the country authorities in the design and implementation of the programs. And so considering the presence of a 3-party coalition government during the negotiations of the 17th Simplified arrangement, I expected to find, in the interviews at least, for the largest coordination problems to happen between 1999 and 2002. And then no major issues starting from 2003. Obviously it becomes exceedingly difficult for country authorities to be convincing during the negotiation process when there is no consensus among the coalition partners regarding the conditionality. And so that's the story about fragmentation. So alternative explanations, obviously, to further strengthen the theory, but I don't want to bore you with so many details. So briefly on my analysis, the 4 cases of IMF lending to Turkey between 1999 and 2008, once again, do provide evidence in support of this 2-level principal agency model I just presented. If you have time left, we can talk about these. But since I don't want you to be swamped with all these details about the Turkish case, I'm going to start talking about the agent-based model part of the presentation. So I guess most of you are familiar with agent-based modeling, as you also had a discussion on it earlier, but I'm not assuming you all to be experts on agent-based modeling. I guess I should not be spending too much time introducing it, but just as a recap, agent-based modeling is the simulation of a multi-agent system with the goal of capturing key theoretical elements of a real world process, right? It is made up of individual agents that are implemented as objects in computer software, and each agent has states and roles that determine its behavior under different conditions. And the process of running an agent-based model involves the instantiation of an agent population, followed by the monitoring of the interactions between the agents. So I utilize agent-based modeling to simulate the interactions between the main actors involved in the design, once again, of an IMF program under various economic and political conditions. And the behavioral roles of the individual agents are extracted from the executive board meeting minutes, as well as the interviews with the IMF staff, directors, and bureaucrats. And the environment variables that influence the preferences of the individual actors include, obviously, the macroeconomic conditions, such as crisis scope surrounding the program design, and concerns regarding the design of the previous IMF programs, and the political conditions under which the government is negotiating. So as for the simulation environment, the environment model in the simulation is, once again, a negotiation process over the inclusion of a list of conditionality in an IMF program. And the model assumes that each conditionality in the program is negotiated separately, independent of each other. Which obviously involves back and forth discussions between the IMF staff and borrowing country bureaucrats, as well as between the bureaucrats and the borrowing country government. And so a decision is reached when one of the negotiators is able to convince the other of the necessity to include specific conditionality in or exclude it from the program. And the main assumption is that the IMF negotiators will always present supporting arguments for the inclusion of conditionality, while the government negotiators will always resist their inclusion. And as negotiations proceed, a softening point will be observed on either side of the argument, and a balance will be reached, resulting in a decision being made for that specific conditionality. So, for the simulation parameters, so this table in a way provides a summary of the simulation variables along with the possible value of range of values for each. And as you know, each agent has particular preferences regarding conditionality design as determined by simulation parameters. And following the assumption of reform-minded inclination, the borrowing country bureaucrats are modeled as pro-conditionality actors in the simulation. So the bureaucrats collectively act as intermediaries between the IMF staff and the borrowing country government until a decision is reached regarding the inclusion of each condition in the program. And the main parameter that determines how much leverage the bureaucrats have on the design of the program is a general, is a function of the scope of the crisis in the country. Once again, based on Reinhardt and Rogoff crisis index. So for each step in the negotiation between the government and the bureaucrats over a specific condition, the variation in the acceptability of the conditionality is weighted by that leverage factor. For IMF staff, agent preferences are modeled using a parameter that represents the legitimacy concerns of the staff, which has the effect of determining how convincing and insistent the staff is when negotiating. And the legitimacy concern parameter is modeled as a function of the general degree of discontent in the executive board, once again, regarding the design of a previous IMF program. So while the borrowing government is modeled as a collective agent in the negotiations with country bureaucrats, in the case of coalition governments, the preferences regarding conditionality are integrated as an average of the individual preferences of the coalition partners. So the preferences of the government regarding the inclusion of specific conditionality are shaped, therefore, by the political contentiousness of the conditionality. That is, politically contentious conditions will likely not be favored by the government. And the model allows for varying the number and coalition partners in the recipient government between 1 and 3, and the degree of divergence of views among the government constituents and the level of criticism expressed by the IMF board members regarding the design of a previous IMF program. Just one sec, I think I'm getting questions. Sorry, I didn't notice that I was getting questions. Like, it's a little tricky when you're sharing screen.
No, it's fine. The purpose is when people have questions, they immediately ask through chat. And when our speakers finish their presentations, they turn back and then answer them.
Okay, perfect. Because I just thought that I would, okay, that works. So I'm noting them. We'll go back to them later, okay? So what I was saying is that the negotiation process is not, it's not too complicated in the simulation. But in reality, obviously, I mean, for the further simulations we did for the project, they are a lot more complicated, particularly when we are modeling it for cases like Greece, when there are more actors involved in the process. You know, that Greece had to negotiate terms with a troika of lenders, which then transformed into a quadriga of lenders in the end. So it makes the simulation a lot more interesting for us, but a lot more complicated, obviously, for the negotiators, the Greek side. So the negotiation process in the model starts with a list of conditionalities specified by the IMF staff, with a neutral acceptability level attached to each condition. And the number of conditions to be negotiated is set to 20 at the beginning of each simulation run, following the data regarding the design of IMF programs in the observed period. We take an average of it. So at each time step during the negotiation process for a condition, the acceptability level of the condition actually changes based on the preferences of the negotiators, and the negotiation is only over when the acceptability level is about a certain threshold, in which case the condition becomes part of the program, or below a certain threshold, then it is not included in the program. The magnitude of change in the degree of acceptance is modeled using a Gaussian process with a mean and variance specified using the values of the simulation parameters for different environment variables. So the thing is, I mean, I know when we talk about this verbally, or just like, you know, showing the code itself doesn't really say much of like how this whole thing works. And for that purpose, I also prepared a small demo of how the simulation works. So let me show that to you too. Okay, where is it? Yeah. I will go full screen if I can. Okay, my internet is slowing down a little. I'll turn off my camera for a sec. I hope it improves a little. So here is how the demo works. The simulation starts with a list of conditions to be negotiated, as I said, And in the experiments, the number of conditions to be negotiated was set to 20, but here in this sample simulation, we have 3 conditions, C1, C2, and C3 for simplicity purposes. All conditions have an acceptance level attached to them, which changes according to the preferences of the IMF staff and the borrowing country government as negotiations proceed. And each negotiation for a condition involves 2 steps. Once again, discussions between the IMF staff and the country bureaucrats, followed by discussion between the borrowing country bureaucrats and the government. So a condition becomes part of a program if its acceptance level exceeds the acceptance threshold, as I said, which is 0.9 in this example, or is ruled out of the program if its acceptance level falls below the rejection threshold, which is 0.4 here. So after the 2-step negotiation process. So the simulation continues until a decision is made, as I said, for all conditions, which means that some conditions may be negotiated multiple times. All conditions initially have the same acceptance level, which is set to 0.65 here, and different levels of political contentiousness once again. So the borrowing country bureaucrats really act as an intermediary between the IMF staff and the government. So the discussions between the IMF staff and the bureaucrats always result in an increase in the acceptance level of a condition. And the amount of increase is determined by a random variable normally distributed with a mean equal to the legitimacy concern of the staff, which is a function of the executive board's concerns regarding a previous program. So that determines how pushy the staff is in the negotiations, and that level in this example is 0.2. Here, after negotiations for C1 start, the value of the acceptance level returns to 0.23, and that changes the acceptance level to 0.88. And the negotiations between the country bureaucrats and the government are, excuse me, are determined by 2 factors: the bureaucratic power, which is a function of the crisis scope, and the political contentiousness of the condition. And here, the amount of decrease in the acceptance level of the condition is again modeled using a random variable normally distributed with an equal mean to the contentiousness of the condition, which is then weighted by the relative power of the government in shaping the program. So in this case, that value returns as 0.28, which updates the acceptance level of C1 to 0.6. So as that value falls between the thresholds, no decision is actually yet made for C1, and we continue with C2 negotiations. Once again, the staff discussions result in an increase of 0.35 in the acceptance level of C2, and the government has a stronger position against the inclusion of C2, resulting in an increase of 0.42, which sets the acceptance level to 0.58, with no decision being reached. Then C3 is negotiated next. The acceptance level increases by 0.2 first, and then decreases by 0.56 due to a higher degree of contentiousness, and then it reaches 0.29, which results in its rejection. And now we have C3 in the list of settled conditions. So negotiations proceed only with C1 and C2 from this point on. Again, C1 is negotiated, its acceptance level increases by 0.38 first, and then decreases by 0.07, which sets the acceptance level to 0.91, resulting in the acceptance of C1. So the only one left to negotiate is C2. Its acceptance level first increases by 0.1 and then decreases by 0.21, resulting in an acceptance level of 0.47. So we have another round of negotiations for C2 in which the staff is not very insistent and the government still shows resistance, resulting in the decrease of the acceptance level to 0.19, which rules C2 out of the program and the simulation stops. And I stopped sharing. Going back to the results. Sorry. Okay. I am hoping the demo was at least somehow helpful in understanding how the simulation actually works. Moving on to the simulation findings. I mean, obviously it very much resembles to the earlier table I showed to you. Let me actually try starting my video again. I hope I don't get cut out. Okay, so I also graphed the results of the simulation findings. Maybe the first set of graphs are not too interesting. I mean, the really interesting part is the interaction of the variables, to be honest. That's something that we could not do otherwise. So while the first three charts demonstrate the effects of each independent variable on the stringency of conditionality independently, it is actually quite important to observe how different independent variables act together in shaping program design, something we do in statistics too, right? So these give us, in a way, better insight into the relative importance of different factors in determining the stringency of conditionality in IMF programs and how one affects program design when considered for a specific setting of another. So the first set of simulations here demonstrates the interactions of executive board discontent level and the political system fragmentation in the borrowing country. And the simulations were performed with the value of crisis scope fixed at 4 and average political contentiousness of conditionality peaks at 0.5 and level of divergence to 0.2. So as we see in the figure, the executive board discontent level actually has a greater effect on the stringency of conditionality as compared to the fragmentation. And increased fragmentation in the government affects the conditionality by a slight margin, but no clear interaction effect is really observed between these two variables in the model. The second set of simulation demonstrates the interaction of the crisis scope and the political system fragmentation. As you can see, crisis scope seems to have a greater effect on the stringency of conditionality than political system fragmentation. And although crisis scope has its biggest effect in the case of a single party government, the difference with the 2-party and 3-party case is really subtle and does not really present a clear evidence for any interaction effects. But the third set of simulations demonstrating the interaction of the executive board discontent and crisis scope, we see the crisis scope having its biggest effect on stringency of conditionality when the executive board discontent level is lowest. So this is sort of an indication that at high levels of executive board discontent with previous programs, the government does not really exhibit much leverage over the design of programs, even when it has high authority over the bureaucrats in the negotiations. With increased executive board discontent, a high level of stringency is reached quickly, even when the crisis scope is quite low. All right, so to conclude, the main findings of this analysis really provide evidence for strong influence of economic bureaucracy on both sides of the negotiations, I would say, on IMF program design, and point through these three mechanisms through which negotiations over conditionality are shaped, as I said. And the findings of this study also have, I would think, significant implications for the study of decision-making processes in international organizations, particularly for instances where delegation of authority is involved at multiple levels or within multiple sides of negotiations, as in the case of IMF lending. And this two-level principal agency model of IMF lending I propose in this work can also be applied to various other studies to sort of illuminate the underlying mechanisms involved in negotiations over conditionality. And as I said, the story actually gets more complicated when the fund collaborates with other institutions. For example, the European Commission to grant financing to a country facing a crisis. And that requires obviously a negotiation process involving many other actors. So in order to be able to accurately account for this like diverse preferences of the actors in such cases, the model can be expanded to include new sets of actors at the second level, that is the collaborating institution, and then the corresponding principal agency problems there, paving way for further research, obviously using this framework. So what we did in this project was to use 3 Southeast European cases as a comparative study to support our argument. But currently we are trying to cover, at least with the executive board meeting minutes analysis, the whole sample that is available on the IMS online archives, as we have access to the executive board meeting minutes. But it's still, as I said, an early stage. We're hoping to finish it in 2 years with the funding we got. On that note, I'll pause here. Thank you so much for listening, and I guess I'll gather your questions from now on.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Let's clap Dr. Angın virtually. Yeah, this was incredible. I mean, wow. Thank you so much. We already have 5 questions, so since they take a while, let's jump straight over. Brock asks, did you extract behavioral rules from semantics of the text of the interviews? So that's the first question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the behavioral rules come not only from the interviews, but also from the secondary data that we use. So for the executive board, we use the executive board meeting minutes. So that also includes the behavior of the IMF staff in a way, the certain mission for that particular country. But for the rest, we rely on the literature first, and also the interviews that I conducted. I mean, the data and theory obviously interacts at that stage, I would say.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jansu goes, since these time periods differ in terms of international climate, global crisis, global monetary expansion period, etc., how can we inject these variations into the simulation?
So in the case of, I mean, assuming that for the global crisis, so for the crisis part, that's already included in the simulation, right? But you could create a different variable for global monetary expansion. But theoretically speaking, that was not necessarily related to our project. So we decided to stick to these 3 main explanatory variables. But obviously, I mean, they all can be integrated. I mean, this is a rather simplified version of the larger project, I would say, because I mean, in the grant project, we actually have a lot more variables included in the model. I mean, this is more like for simplicity purposes, we include 3 variables to explain in the ABM I presented today. But yeah, I mean, with an agent-based model, you can include as many variables as you like. Like there is really, sky's the limit. But I mean, obviously, that could complicate, I would say, your theories then testing with case studies, because you would not be able to actually control for certain variables with some cases. I don't like, by the way, to use the word test when we're talking about case studies, because you really cannot test like we do in statistics. But that's more or less what you could do with that. Do you want me to read the questions, by the way, or would you like to read them out loud?
Since you've been like speaking for such a long period of time,
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
Is that the Bodleian, by the way, in the background, or which library is that?
Hogwarts.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. I was like, is that Bodleian? Yeah.
No.
Yeah, okay, it's the best library there. So, Ezgi goes, could you please talk about NLP and sentiment analysis in an international organization's document? When you do sentiment analysis to a formal organization, do they have more neutral tone? How would it differ from doing sentiment analysis to tweets? These questions are excellent, by the way. I mean,
They are
congratulations.
excellent indeed. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's an excellent question indeed. I mean, and yes, obviously the sort of documents that we analyze are very much technical. Even though they are the most political documents at the IMF level, because I mean, even the interviews that I conducted with the IMF mission or the IMF staff in general were just so technical. The IMF is quite proud in portraying itself as this institution that actually takes all its decisions based on neutral economic rationality. So you still get that tone in the executive board, because executive directors, some of them are also coming from an econ background, but there are still political issues that are discussed. What we do is, so while we go through our dictionary, we try to include certain words to measure the discontent, but it's not similar, obviously, to a sentiment analysis of tweets because they are pretty standard. So you don't really get that much variation in the executive board meeting minutes. When an executive director wants to raise a concern about a certain program, there is some certain phrases that they use. So I would think that it's maybe easier to do NLP on such documents than in sentiment analysis to tweets. Yeah. So the thresholds derived, that's a straightforward question. We again just take the average of the statistical analysis we also do as a separate leg of the research. For the thresholds for the executive board's discontent, so on and so forth, again, they're manually coded, and it's the simulation, obviously. It's in a way a portrayal of the theory. It's not like the reality per se. It's usually the question I get about computational simulations, because people sometimes get confused about where you get this data. It's not actually a real data that you run regressions on. And that's why I sometimes like try to use like this like demo or like other ways of describing the project, because it really gets confusing. Like, how did you come up with this? And it's, in a way, you can think of it as game theoretical model in a way, because it could be considered formal modeling, I guess, but it is done by a computer. You literally reflect your theory in like, just code it in whichever software you like and just let it run for multiple times and get an average from it. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's sometimes really difficult to explain how this works. But the following question is, I think, is about normal distribution assumption. Yeah, the assumption is normal distribution, and it was derived from again, the data that we have. How to validate models similar to this? How has your experience been like in this particular study? So for Efe's question, do you mean like as in validation with different parameters, or what do you exactly mean by validating models similar to this?
Efe? Is Efe there? Yes, Efe is there.
Okay.
Hello, Efe. Efe, can you hear us? You can go over other questions. Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
okay. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, let's go to Burak's. Do you suppose that behavior rules stays same throughout the negotiation? It might be subjected to change if the negotiations last for a longer period of time.
So here's the thing. I mean, obviously, in a next iteration of this simplified version of the model I showed, that could be another parameter to be included, as in the duration of the negotiations could be another thing to take into account. But in reality, as what we try to do is to, like, you know, I mean, come as close to reality as possible with a simulation. In reality, the negotiations cannot go on for years. Like, at the end of the day, when a country needs an IMF loan, that means that, like, usually that country is in dire need of IMF money. And so, therefore, the negotiation duration, okay, so because in countries such as Turkey, I think bureaucrats' behavior might change in a short time due to internal politics issues. So the thing is, I mean, here what we try to do is to simulate the negotiations between the IMF and the country, borrowing country government, right? And as I said, the bureaucrat's utility function is actually different. We're not assuming that the bureaucrats are acting according to internal political issues. If they were, like, this is the assumption of the model, if they were allowed to take decisions on their own, they would do this based on economic rationality. We are referring to a very particular set of bureaucrats, though, economic bureaucrats. So that is the assumption of the model. And therefore, the duration of the negotiations would depend on the political contentiousness of the conditionality that was being negotiated. Could be a privatization of a state-owned enterprise, for example. That could be politically contentious for some. Quantitative targets are also sometimes quite politically contentious for the government. But I mean, especially when the IMF tries to put labor market conditions to IMF programs, that's when you really get a pushback from the government, because it is really politically costly for them to lay off workers, etc., right? And our assumption, once again, is that the bureaucrats negotiating these terms are not the ones who are concerned about the political consequences of the implementation of these conditionality. It is the government who's concerned about it. But once again, I mean, when you look at the average, if a program is actually signed with the IMF, it happens pretty fast. If a country is just negotiating a program just for the sake of giving a positive signal to the market, and that's something Turkey did actually after the end of the 2008 program. Turkey negotiated another IMF program with the fund for almost a full year. They didn't actually intend to sign, but it was right after the 2008 global financial crisis erupted, and it was giving a positive signal to the market. It worked for Turkey in the end, but they did not sign an agreement with the IMF. But that would not enter our sample. So, yeah, I'll pause there and read the rest.
I think that the next question, I think will probably be asked again and again by people from different countries, because I think your research has already been extremely useful and relevant, but now with COVID and all, like, international financial systems, like, kind of backtracking, I think it's at least, like, doubly more important right now. And people are going to come ask you, like, have you applied this model to the Argentinian case or other, like, EMs that are struggling, or even like non-EMs that are struggling? So what about, like, other cases?
For the other cases, as I said, I mean, currently we already have Romania and Greece that we analyzed. And the next stage of the paper will choose probably a South American country. Not maybe Argentina at the moment, because it's one of the really most overstudied cases in this particular context. But there are so many more clients coming up, as you said. With the Romanian and Greek cases, the main difference that we noticed was, particularly in the case of Greece, the structure of the bureaucracy is really different. So this model actually holds in cases where the bureaucrats, the negotiators, are coming from, in a way, similar educational backgrounds, which then leads to a similar mindset view on economics, to be honest. And that was precisely the case for Romania. Romanian bureaucrats that we interviewed were mostly in line with the IMF. They also borrowed from a troika of lenders. It was not the IMF only for the period that we covered. But I mean, it's an interesting case because Romania borrowed from the IMF when it was still a communist country, and then as a transition economy, and then as an EU member state. So there were really different actors involved in the negotiations. And the IMF is really an important actor in Romanian history. Some consider it the reason why the Ceausescu regime collapsed in the end, because he rushed in paying back the debt to the IMF. So, but you still see, like, despite all this bitter taste that IMF programs left in the country, I would say, the bureaucrats were still saying that we were pretty much in line with them, like thinking it was just the politicians, the corrupt politicians, that didn't want to implement all these reforms. You don't hear that in the case of Greece. Greece is a different case, and sometimes it's considered an outlier, I would say. That's why it's kind of a problematic case maybe to select to, but again, it's one of the overstudied cases. The structure of the bureaucracy is a lot different than the other two cases I talked about. And also, I think it's a lot more complicated considering it's like zero history with the IMF. It was literally the first time they were designing a program for them. And it was also the first time the European Commission and the European Central Bank had to tailor a program together. And so they brought the IMF in. So the dynamics are a lot different than the other two, I would say. But that also is the reason why I don't really like to use the word test in case studies, because you just cannot drive generalizable theory just from one case study, obviously. And that's really not what we try to do with the cases. What we try to do is to see how the negotiation process works with countries with similar economic situations in the same region, different actors involved. And as I said, the next step is looking maybe still with similar economic fundamentals, like, again, a developing country, obviously, because developed countries don't really borrow from the IMF. Depends on how you label developed, but anyway. So Mexico is a candidate country for the research at the moment, but we'll see how that goes. But we're getting more questions, so I probably should pause and
We have next Matti's question. Could you speak a bit more about the other case studies, etc.? You had to support about agent-based. What are the ones? Matti, can you clarify this question? I didn't understand this question. Matti, is Matti there? Oh, is Matti gone?
Maybe Matti? I answered. I was just thinking, maybe is that a question about the, in a way, selection criteria for the other cases? I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah, let's move on. Efe and Ahmet's questions, I think, can be answered together. The first question is, the negotiation process is not directly observable. You mentioned that you use the duration of the process instead. How do you think your approach compares to reality? And why do you think it's better compared to a game theoretic approach? And I think the second question is very close to that. Regarding the research design, do you recommend always combining ABM with other methods such as case studies, or are standalone ABM papers academically acceptable and publishable as well?
So starting from Ozan's question, I found it rather difficult to get a standalone ABM paper published. Honestly, it depends also on which field you're at. I do have the disadvantage of being an IP scholar because agent-based modeling is still not so popular, I would say, in our field. And people try to stick to the methods they are more familiar with, because otherwise they would have to like spare time to learn what ABM is. And that's kind of like, I think the reason why we tend to get this like pushback when we send our papers for review. And obviously, I mean, it's a personal choice, but I mean, what I see in, at least in my literature, I would say, or my field, is that, and this applies to other mixed methods being a lot more popular than sticking to a single method. I mean, you see that with statistical analysis too. Like nowadays, like, you know, the top one journal in our field is International Organization, and you see like lots of quantitative papers being complemented by like not case studies maybe, but some like illustrative cases nowadays. So the same goes for ABM, more so for ABM and game theoretical modeling, I would say. It is still acceptable to just do a formal modeling exercise in the field of economics, I think. Or at least if you are Darun Acamoğlu, I don't know. I mean, for junior scholars, it's a little different, I guess. But I guess it's I would say it's easier to get it published if you do have empirics too in it. So just ABM, maybe it's more acceptable if you're in ethnic conflict, civil war literature, but it's not so acceptable, I think, at the moment, at least for IP research. And going back to what Efe asked, I guess, that use the duration of the process instead. How do you think your approach compares to reality? The negotiation process is not observable. What I meant by using the duration was referring to if I wanted to add the possibility of a longer negotiation having an effect on the number of conditions, then I would take the duration. That's what I was trying to get at. Obviously, the negotiation process is happening behind the closed doors. Like the closest you could get is just to derive information from the interviews to come close to reality, because there is no other data you could use. Like there are no recorded minutes of the negotiations, if that's what you're asking. And why do I think that it's a better approach to compare? Because for game theoretical modeling, the thing is, like, you know, the moment you have more than two actors and you're interested in microprocesses, game theoretical modeling it's not going to be that helpful, especially if you are integrating this many actors in a model, right? You don't get this flexibility. Obviously, the game theoretical approach has the advantage of being, I would think, being easier to be maybe read by a larger audience. It's an older approach at the end of the day. At least, again, I can speak for my field. But I don't necessarily find any advantage of game theory over ABM. The earlier question, I guess I answered Burak's question,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we have Cansu's final question. Mm-hmm. How the complexity of the simulation may increase linear or exponentially if extra agents are added to the agent-based model? When constructing the model, the main concern regarding complexity is related with computational issues or the explanatory power of our theory?
Not not necessarily the exploitatory power. I would be concerned about, again, how to reach the audience, because the main problem I'm having with this project, the ABM leg of it though, not the rest, because people seem to be a lot more open to machine learning, for example, for estimation for somehow, but not ABM. Again, all I say here is just applying to my field. It doesn't apply to all the fields in political science, but when you submit a paper for review, the main issue is the reviewer just doesn't understand. Maybe it's my fault, maybe I don't explain it in such a way that it can be read by a larger audience, but the moment it starts getting a little bit more complicated than ideal, maybe, you get pushed back. And that's like the primary concern. I don't think a simulation has any problems with handling different levels. Like, you can have as many levels as you like in a simulation. You can have as many agents as you like in a simulation. And if you understand how ABM works, that would not be a problem for you to understand the workings of the simulation either. My primary concern is, especially for those who are new to this method, would be like, you know, how do you explain your model in such a way that you wouldn't be punished for trying to find the nuance. Yeah, I guess that explains what I tried to say, but if there are any other questions, I didn't, by the way, put my email address, but if there are any further questions, please always feel free to email me. And well, if there are no other questions, I'm just gonna say thank you all so much. This was actually really a fruitful kind of discussion for me too, because I tend to actually present at heterodox economics conferences, and like maybe there was just like one isolated conference where I got to interact with other social scientists doing ABM. So this is literally the first time that I was able to present the topic to people who are interested in computational social science. So thank you again for the invitation. Thank you all.
This was brilliant. Thank you so much. And basically, both ABM and also like IMF decision-making processes, etc. It's basically a very welcome addition to our focus, which has so far been how to generate social science knowledge from things like trace data, cell phone data, social media text, website text, and so on. Like IMF and ABM has been incredibly, like, it broadened our horizons to a great degree. It was incredibly useful. Matti has a daily survey. Again, rest of the people, participants, again, Matti gets very mad at you when you don't fill out the survey. The survey is about what we did has been good, what we did has been not good. He gets mad when you put things that are not good, but he gets even more mad when you don't fill out the form. So that form is very important. But Professor Angın, thank you so much. This has been incredibly useful and also enjoyable for all of us. And given, oh yeah, so Emre put your email address at the bottom.
Thank you, Emre.
So people who want to email Professor Angın can do so. So with this brilliant presentation, we basically end our first week of the Summer Institute. This was kind of like closing lecture for the first week. Beginning of the second week on Monday, we start with a computational social science festival, which will be live with Princeton, Duke, and other sites. There'll be incredible speakers, like world-class computational scientists. I think most of you have already signed up. But Emre, if Professor Angın also wants to like join, maybe you can like send the sign-up link.
Sure.
Yeah, because that festival is going to be truly amazing.
I think Emre did already. Yeah, I have it actually marked in my calendar. Yeah, thank you so much.
And yeah, we're right now, moving over into the group projects phase of the Summer Institute. And I think I will close with another Matti warning. We only have 3 responses. We need more to our daily survey. That's very important. But let's close the session. Again, thank you so much, Professor.